Welcome and thank you all for joining us on today's webinar. This is a series of 2 sessions by the America-Israel Friendship League and the Israel Democracy Institute on understanding Israel's democratic system and November's upcoming elections. This is a pre and post session that we will be holding. It is great to see such a wonderful audience from all over the United States. We also have participants, some from international around the world, which is also wonderful to have. My name is Jeremy Weiss, and I recently joined the AIFL, a unique and important organization, as Vice President. I would now like to introduce you to our speaker, Professor Yohanan Plesner. Professor Plesner is the president of the Israel Democracy Institute. Professor Plesner grew up in Jerusalem and served in one of the top Israeli Defense Forces units for many years. He holds a BA in economics from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and an MA in public policy, economy, and international security from Harvard University. Yohanan, as well, has extensive experience in the private business sector in a wide range of senior positions. He also served as a member of the Israeli parliament in the Knesset from 2007 to 2013. These are only some of Professor Plesner's impressive professional experience, and you can see his bio on the invitation. So, Yohanan, perhaps we can start this presentation with a general intro on where we stand now in Israel regarding the upcoming elections. And maybe you can a little bit discuss also how the Israeli democratic process works and how is it possibly similar or different from the US system?
Okay, so hi, Jeremy, and hello, everyone, and thanks for having me. It's an honor and privilege to engage in, to join this, participate in this event with the AIFL. We've collaborated in the past. It's a very important organization, and at IDI, Israel Democracy Institute, we're always motivated to engage in, and to collaborate on such events. Thanks also for the kind personal introduction. You even made my late mother very happy by adding the title professor, which I don't deserve, to my to the other elements of my bio, which were correct. So now,
but the others are correct.
So now to the discussion itself. Well, you know, for many Americans, the nature of the Israeli government and democratic system seems bizarre and unique and is difficult to comprehend. And especially now, after 5 election campaigns, people tend to sort of scratch their head and ask, you know, what's going on there? So how does it work? So Israel is different than the US. We are a parliamentary democracy. Israelis vote in one constituency and vote for different parties. They vote for parties to represent them in parliament. Afterwards, the parliament convenes and selects a government led by a prime minister. So Israelis next Tuesday, in a day and a half, are going to vote for multiple parties. And traditionally around 10, give or take, anywhere between 8, 9, and 14, 15 parties cross the threshold of 3.25% of the entire vote. So if you have more than 3.25%, you enter into parliament, and then the parliament, you need a majority of MKs, i.e. 61 out of 120, to positively vote a vote of confidence in a new government. So this is our system, and the legislature, the Knesset, and the government are accompanied by the third branch of government, which is an independent, internationally recognized judiciary. And all of this system of checks and balances, unfortunately, in a relatively young but stable democracy, all of these arrangements are not protected and not guaranteed by a constitution. Israel was established in 48, We did not have a constitution. There was a decision that the constitution will be legislated within a year, and 74 years later, we're still waiting for that constitution to be legislated. This means, if we see now the slide in front of us, if we compare the Israeli system to the US, so we do not have a constitution that means that some of the basic pieces of legislation require a large majority. For example, if we take the American example, in the US, there's a Bill of Rights that ensures the basic fundamental liberty, freedom of speech, and so on, and those are guaranteed by the Constitution, and there's an independent judiciary that protects them. Israel does not have a Bill of Rights, and the institutional arrangements, the division of power, the checks and balances between the institutions is not guaranteed with a supermajority. We do not have local governments, like say in the US. The municipalities are pretty much legally controlled by the government and gain their authority from the central government. We do not have, to some extent, an independent legislator, because the legislator votes the government, and the government traditionally in Israel fully controls the parliament. If you want a piece of legislation to pass in the Knesset, the government legislative committee needs to support it. Otherwise, there's no chance to get a majority, and so on. So there's, unlike the American case with the House and Senate that are independent and sometimes can be confrontational to the executive branch, we do not have that in Israel. So the only constraint to the otherwise absolute majority of the executive branch is an independent judiciary that, again, its authorities are not constitutionally protected, but traditionally over more than 70 years, it evolved that there's a judiciary that is strong and constrains the power, and conducts judicial review and constrains the power of the government. So that's a sort of relatively long intro, but it sort of sets the stage.
So as you mentioned, in Israel's democratic system, we don't vote for, like in the United States, for an individual. We vote for a party, and the head of the party then could be voted in as the prime minister. Does that have any impact on the upcoming elections or the elections we've been having recently? This is the 5th election in several years. Is that an element in why we're having so many elections right now?
Yes, well, we're in a political crisis. It's not, not a secret and cannot be concealed. So in December of 2018, the Knesset dissolved itself, and we went for an early election. And ever since, the first election was in April of 2019, and now since 3.5 years later, we're entering our 5th election campaign. And as you can see in the table in front, Israel is world champion we compare it to other parliamentary democracies, at least a couple of dozen. We're world champions in election frequency. And then the question Jeremy, you asked is, so what's the reason for this crisis that evidently we're experiencing? I would say there are 3 reasons: 2 systemic and 1 circumstantial. The 2 systemic are, number 1 is the weakness of our constitutional arrangements. We mentioned it before. So it actually creates a hunger to initiate constitutional changes, because basically, if in America, in order to initiate a constitutional change, you need a special majority in the House, a special majority in the Senate, 75% or so of states to ratify it. You need a president that will be on board. Then the hunger for constitutional amendments is relatively tamed, because it's virtually impossible. In Israel, it's round the corner, and in an age of identity politics, of tribal struggles, when the nature of the system is a winner takes all, with 61 versus 59, you can change the fundamental features of the system. It creates a terrible hunger to sort of defeat the other rather than reach broad consensus. So this is one systemic element. Systemic element number two is the electoral system. The electoral system in Israel is such that I described it before, and it produces governments that are relatively unstable. So we saw the election frequency. Also, ministers in Israel are their time in office is particularly short if you compare it to other countries, and it's been shortened since the 90s. So, finance ministers are less than, anywhere between less than 2 years, interior ministers, less than 2 years. So there's a huge turnover of ministers, of governments, of Knessets, and this unstable environment produces a much less effective government. Now, why is our electoral system so unstable? If I have Jeremy to select one feature, it's the unbearable ease of disintegrating the Knesset. We compare Israel to other parliamentary democracies, to dozens of other parliamentary democracies. Only in 2 systems can parliaments just with a simple majority disintegrate themselves and dissolve themselves. And this is the case in Israel. So the entire political game, the entire function of politics and politicians is, once they're not in power, is to dissolve the Knesset rather than erect a new government within the same Knesset, or even just gain influence with their political power. So the system is entirely geared towards disintegrating the Knesset. This is a systemic weakness that derives from a deviation in our systemic arrangement. And the third factor, which is not systemic, so we spoke about the fact that we don't have a constitution, weaknesses in our electoral system. Those are 2 systemic features that have been pronounced, accentuated, augmented by the crisis. The third element is the fact that we have a very popular, a very experienced, a very motivated politician, probably the most talented politician in Israel's history, and for sure in the last decade, Mr. Netanyahu, who has been indicted and is now fighting to clear his name in court against very severe crimes of breach of trust and bribery. And the fact that Mr. Netanyahu, on the one hand, is dealing with such severe crimes, on the other hand, is adamant to hold on to his position in government, to remain prime minister, even if under a conflict of interest, creates a unique situation whereby there's a very strong bloc that will go pretty much only with Netanyahu, and a very strong bloc that will never go with Netanyahu as a result of that. So overlay that pro and anti-Netanyahu situation on top of systemic, constitutional, and electoral weaknesses, and here we are 3.5 years later with a 5th election campaign, and perhaps even heading towards a 6th one.
Well, I hear you, and I just was questioning to myself, and I think some of the audience also asked that question. In a way, on the checks and balances, having an opposition and a coalition is theoretically, and I'm asking, when the system was built, to balance off. We are now finding ourselves where the opposition is not, in a way, just balancing off, but is also trying to demolish the coalition. But is this causing, I mean, we walk the streets of Israel, and we live in the country, and we do feel a very strong democratical system. We feel that we have a voice. We feel we have the rights. Do you feel, or do you think that there is a growing number of Israelis that are questioning the liability and the purity of the elections, or is that still a small minority?
Well, unfortunately, Israel is part of the world, and there's a major crisis of trust in their entire democratic world. I'm disregarding for a moment the non-democratic world. We're also seeing intensifying trends of authoritarianism and so on. But even within the democratic world, probably the single most influential factor is the shift of the, I would say, the political in the public debate from traditional media to social media, and this is the single largest contributor to this crisis of trust. And this crisis of trust is also affecting Israeli democracy, where about 39% of Israelis in one of our latest polls at IDI of Israelis are questioning whether the elections will be carried out properly and with integrity. And this is before a massive campaign has been triggered to question, to second guess or undermine the integrity of the election. So we are not immune. And actually our immune system, unlike, is even weaker than other democracies, again, because of our weaker institutional arrangements. So Israel is a democracy that we are proud of, is to some extent a miracle, because we're in around 9.5 million citizens. Israel was established in 48 by Jews who came here from all over the world, but the vast majority, I would say roughly 90%, came from non-democratic countries and non-democratic traditions, and joined a local population of citizens, the Arab citizens, and so we came from non-democratic traditions, but nevertheless we established a democracy, and we're proud of, and our democracy withstood serious challenges, including the Rabin murder and the disengagement. I mean, points and major wars and security events, and a wave of terror that in the second Intifada 20 years ago. That all of these are serious shocks to the system that can easily bring about the rise of populism and so on. And nevertheless, Israeli democracy delivered and demonstrated its inner strength. And Israelis love their liberties and love their democracy. So this is the positive. But Jeremy, there's also a negative. Again, there's the social networks that are plowing the same seeds of disbelief and distrust as in other parts of the world, also the US. And increasingly we see I would point out two figures. Number one, a majority of Israelis today, around, I think in one of our latest polls, 56% of Israelis who think that our democracy is in serious threat. So, so this is what Israelis think. And number two, also a majority of Israelis are, and this is a figure that has been growing, we've been following throughout the years, a growing number of Israelis who have a desire to see a strong leader that would disregard the Knesset, the media, and other constraining institutions. So again, part of this messy situation produces a desire to see a strong man, quote unquote, or woman that will sort things out. This is a danger to a democracy. So we cannot just be complacent and assume that if we manage to thrive and survive and prosper as a democracy for 74 years, we should just take it for granted that this will continue to be the case.
It's interesting. You mentioned obviously social media and the impact, but this is not unique for Israel. This is what we're encountering in all Western democracies, and not only in Western democracies. We see this also in other countries, just for example, Iran. But when you say sort things out, we need a strong leader. Is this connected to the external security challenges that Israel is facing? Meaning, you yourself mentioned that over the establishment of Israel, from the day of the establishment of Israel till today, Israel has encountered many challenges, both internal, but a lot of them external. and the external challenges are immense, yet we are still a democracy. How do you relate to these external challenges in the democracy today in the elections?
Well, there's no doubt that it's more difficult to sustain, preserve, strengthen a democratic system and a democratic culture when you are constantly facing an external existential security threat. This basic logic or basic insight was what led former Secretary of State George Shultz to be a strong supporter, an advocate for the establishment of the Israel Democracy Institute more than 30 years ago. So more than 30 years ago, George Shultz met with the founder of the institute that I have the privilege to lead today, Dr. Al Kalmon, and our international chairman, Bernie Marcus, and he said, Israel, you cannot take for granted Israeli democracy, because when you are constantly under an existential threat, and today we used to say Israel is the only democracy that is under an existential threat. Today we can also count South Korea and Ukraine, and I would say many of the European countries no longer feel like they're not under an existential threat. So we're not alone in this club anymore, but for sure we are leading members of it. And when there's an existential threat, citizens, and you can also say rightly so, tend to do away and to more easily give up on their basic liberties in the name of security. So when citizens are killed in terror attacks and so on, it's more likely to raise tensions, especially in a country like ours when there's a large, sizable Arab minority, and our Arab citizens, a component of their identity is Palestinian, and we're still in an active conflict with the Palestinian people. So those are inherent mechanisms that render it a lot more difficult to sustain a democracy. So Israeli democracy, almost by definition, because of the external pressures and because of internal social divisions, some even label it tribal divisions, this makes it even more challenging to sustain a democracy, regardless of the fact that we don't have a constitution. Again, Jeremy, I don't want to sound pessimistic, because we are very proud of our democracy and our economy and our achievements, but we have to be fully aware of the challenges and the difficulties and the barriers that we're confronting in order to ensure that Israel will be a success story in the next 40, 50, 70 years.
I also think, and I hear you very well, and as an Israeli, although I was born in the United States, but as an Israeli, I feel the concerns you're mentioning, and definitely the external existential threats are extremely disturbing, because in a way, a significant, strong leader might solve those external threats and then allow us to go back to where we were, right? But saying that, I think also the fact
and then
that
a strong, but you know how it is. Once you devolve, or not devolve power, but rather concentrate power, and this is a human tendency throughout history, and we look throughout the world. A human tendency is for leaders to want to concentrate power, and once power is concentrated, it's difficult to devolve. The logic is that America has a democracy that's great. This suspicion of too much power for the government and allocating power in different institutions and ensuring that citizens have rights. This arrangement, I would say, is not necessarily a natural outcome of communal arrangements. And we can see most of the world it doesn't exist. And now some of the ideas that have been surfaced up for the upcoming election in Israel, some of the ideas, the common denominator is of concentrating pretty much all governing power, all state power within the political majority, undermining the professional bureaucracy, undermining the independent judiciary, undermining independent law enforcement. So there are some disconcerting initiatives that are now on the agenda, and again, depending on the outcome on the election, might also become the law of the land.
I hear you, and it's, on one hand, very disturbing. On the other hand, I'm proud to be part of the democracy. I'd like to hear your opinion, running something by you for a moment. You and myself and my children and everybody around us, the majority have served in the IDF. Many of our families came to this country decades ago from other countries to build a country. So in a way, Israelis feel that they have a share within this country. We're not just citizens. We take part. We sacrifice our lives in service. We walk the streets, and sometimes it's dangerous. There are missile attacks. So in a way, we're so connected and we have so opinionated. I'm questioning, does that have a strong impact on where we are? Meaning the segmentation or the challenges between different parts of ideological opinions is even increased because of each one feeling so connected and so responsible to one's country.
Yes, although, I could have used the same argument to explain also a different outcome. But yes, we do have skin in the game, as you mentioned, and we feel connected and we're risking our lives. I still serve as a major in reserves and the special forces unit. Actually, my daughter in about a week and a half will complete her training as a combatant in a special forces unit as well, and I'm a proud dad. So it's the effort and the risk and the sense of belonging and perhaps this sense of partnership that also creates a very strong sentiment about how the state of affairs should be managed and so on. So this is on the one hand. On the other hand, we have, we mentioned the word tribes. We have different tribes with different visions about how this Israel as a Jewish and democratic state should look like and should be led. So we have, and those tribes are not are to some extent all quite dominant or imperialistic tribes, because they have a vision not only for themselves but for the state. So if you look at obviously the traditional Zionist idea was to have Israel as a Jewish and democratic state, but there's a strong and growing ultra-Orthodox tribe that wants Israel to be a halacha, a state run by the halacha, by Jewish law, and this is a growing component of our electorate. If the Netanyahu camp reaches this sort of the magic number of 61 out of 120, the ultra-Orthodox parties will play a very important role in that future Netanyahu coalition. They're expected to have 15 or 16 seats, and Netanyahu will be absolutely dependent on them. And their agenda now is to dramatically increase the funding for their educational institutions without any requirements for core curriculum and so on. So there's that vision for the state, and there's a vision of some who represent the Arab minority, a minority that, again, a sizable minority of about 20% that want Israel to be basically a state of all its citizens without a unique Jewish component in its national identity. And in this respect, there's a real, I would say, struggle over the soul and future of Zionism. So rather than our politics in public life, rather than constituting arguments around questions of policy, higher taxes, lower taxes, defense in this way or the other, it's really about deeper questions of identity politics, identity of the state, and many Israelis are fearful. Israelis of different groups are fearful of becoming a part of a minority that in a country without a constitution, a minority that its way of life will be under risk and will not be respected. So it's those are serious issues that we're contending with, and our future is yet to be written. But it's,
you mentioned several times throughout this presentation the lack of a constitution. Could you share with us, and I think one of the audience also asked this question, what was the original reasoning for not having this constitution? Was there a logic, or was it just the development of a young country, a young state? And the second thing is, we do have some what we call Chukei Yesod, basic laws.
Yeah.
Is that not in a way filling in for the lack of the constitution?
It does fill in a way, but not in a sufficient way. The Israeli, the closest thing we have to a constitution, or at least to an introductory chapter to a constitution that defines the state institutions and character of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state, is obviously the Declaration of Independence. It was read on the day that Israel was established and signed by all members of the then parliament that was being constituted. So this is the closest thing we have to a constitution and to a document that defines the values of Israel as a state of the Jewish people and as a democratic state at the same time. But this was not translated, once the Knesset was established, was not translated into a fully fledged constitution, because mainly because there were some disagreements and disputes at the time, mainly around questions of religion and state. So they couldn't reach a majority with the religious parties. For them, Zionism and Israel as a Jewish state was not Jewish, not in the national sense, but more in the religious sense. And they wanted more of a religious content. And the mainstream and leaders at the time, Ben Gurion, etc., did not want that. So they decided, let's try to achieve consensus over time. And they passed this decision of, let's take a year and establish the Knesset, and a year to establish a law and constitution committee that will legislate chapters of the Constitution, and within a year we will bind them together. That was the idea back in 1949 when the Knesset was first established. Just sort of as an anecdote, between 2009 and 2013, I served in that Law and Constitution Committee in the Knesset. So even, it was supposedly established for a year, but what it did, rather than legislating a fully fledged constitution, it began to legislate chapters of the constitution, what you call basic laws. Now, those basic laws are treated as our sort of chapters of our non-existent constitution, but their main weakness is the fact that they're not guaranteed in a super majority or any super procedure or process. So the same simple majority, say of 61, that legislated our basic laws can unwind them. And here we see in this interesting slide the number of constitutional amendments, basically what we call amendments to basic laws in Israel. 21 amendments were made in 5 years. I think it's the 5 years is somewhere between 2015 and 2020. But even if you take any chunk of other 5 years, it would probably not be very different. So it's our constitutional arrangements are very elastic because it's so easy to change. So given the political constraints, political needs, there's constitutional amendments, and you can compare it to the US, where 27 amendments were made since the Constitution was legislated back in 1789. So America is really on the other end of the spectrum, extremely rigid. And you have here the numbers of the other parties, 15 in France, 6 since 1953. So there's no doubt that the Israeli case is extremely elastic. And again, the big risk is that in a political culture that does not respect the norm, that changes to the rules of the game need to be initiated with the consensus after long dialogue and with the especially large majority. If this is not the norm, but rather if I have 61, I can do away with everything, and basically 61 can erase the rights, the identity, the will of the remaining 59. And then the 59, once they will become 61, they will change it back in the other direction. This does not produce a stable democratic outcome and consensus. And Jerry, finally, you said before, well, it's, there's more tension in Israel because we all have skin in the game and therefore we care. And I said, well, it's one outcome, and I don't disagree with you that this is the outcome that we're witnessing. But I would imagine also that we can produce a different outcome because we all have skin in the game and we understand that we're here together and nobody's going anywhere and all the tribes are here now and in the future. There should be an incentive. Let's try and find a way to live together to produce a stable, prosperous state and to learn how to manage our disagreements in a more amicable manner. Absolutely.
And I think, again, what we're seeing in many places around the world is more and more segmentation of the society, together with social media, which enforces or supports the segmentation. And in the past, we had several major parties, and now we have many parties, which is, in a way reflecting, I suppose, the segments or the lack of satisfaction with what's going on. And there's, on the other hand, we are thriving economically. There are more and more agreements with Arab countries that were once non-friendly, and now we have peace treaties with them. Israeli Arabs have the right to vote, and there's more of them taking a stand. The ultra-Orthodox.
Not only do they have the right to vote, clearly their vote is decisive in the outcome of the election and the identity of the prime minister. So,
right. And in a way, there's a discrepancy, I feel, between the positive growth of what's going on in this young state and the challenges of democracy that we're facing. This discrepancy, although you have explained it, still are shocking and surprising.
Yeah, it's a phenomenal success story in many respects. Economically, I mean, we're in just one figure, close to $170 billion of exports this year, expected this year in 2022. 170 billion in comparison to Russia's 400 billion, where they have all these natural resources and a huge empire of 150 million. So it's phenomenal, and we have much to be proud of. But it also means that we should be responsible enough to ensure that this success story continues.
You mentioned that your daughter is serving in the IDF. My daughter as well is now a squadron commander in a combat unit. And she serves with boys and girls, totally equally under the stretcher, we say in Israel, boys and girls carrying the stretcher together. And in her unit, you will find religious and non-religious, young girls and boys from kibbutzim, social communities, and from capitalistic cities, from high and low economical backgrounds. You'll find Druze soldiers and even some Muslim Bedouins, and you'll find new immigrants from Sudan, Christian immigrants, homosexuals and lesbians, and the whole spectrum of Israeli society, all in a uniform, serving together, no matter what the political background is. And I think in that part of the side, that really reinforces our basic common denominators. On the other hand, do you think there's any danger that we can see of having the IDF in any way, like we've seen in other countries in the history around the world, taking some sort of a stand against the government?
Can you just repeat the final part of the question?
Do you think, like we've seen in other countries around the world, where the army has taken a stand against the government, in a way, an uprising against the army? Can you see such a situation in Israel?
No. Israel is, the military is also, it's not a closed professional guild. It's, it's my daughter, it's your daughter, it's the model of service is called the People's Army, which means everybody serves mandatory service, although, again, supposedly everybody serves. It's a different issue. Some parts of society dodge service in various ways, but still there is a strong tradition of government control over the military establishment. It's true that in terms of defense policy, we have a very strong professional military establishment, IDF, Shin Bet, Mossad, and the entire array of the police is perhaps not as strong, it has many authorities, not as strong an institution, but traditionally those institutions are very strong in ensuring, in setting security policy and ensuring continuity, but there was never any doubt on the big questions on civil control over the military, and I don't expect that to change.
Which is fascinating. Once again, perhaps the fact that we're a young nation still trying to find our way in a challenging environment, internally, externally, running so fast, we are now confronting these major changes.
We're now dealing with the challenges of adolescence as a,
right.
as a stage.
Right. So in that stage of adolescence, exactly. What, if for our audience that are interested in what's going on in Israel and might open up the radio, television, the news and read, what should they be looking out for in a day and a half on this coming Tuesday? And what should they be tuned into?
Well, first of all, we might not, unless there's a resounding outcome, we might not know the result on the exit polls of Tuesday night in Israel, because it's such a close call, 60 for the pro-Netanyahu camp and 60 for those who oppose him. It's such a close call, and the final results, obviously it's only exit polls. The final results are also depend on counting additional about 400,000 votes of soldiers and others that are voting separately. And then it also requires to see the various calculations of who crossed the threshold and the different calculations. And if it's a close call, a huge, any difference of an allocation of an additional seat can make a huge difference. So again, that's one thing is time. Let's wait until there's the final result. Number two, obviously, during the day of the election, one has to look for turnout in the Arab sector. That's there's a huge deviation there. In 2020, there were in the third round of the election, 65% went out, and then a year later, 44. And that's a huge difference between, 15 seats for the Arab representatives, as high as 15, and it can go depending if some don't cross the threshold, and since now it can even go to 0 or 4 or 5 or 8. So it's a huge deviation that will for sure it's one single factor that can determine the entire outcome of the election. Now the current prediction is close to 50. Then turnout in Likud strongholds, that traditionally in some of the Likud strongholds in cities like Ashkelon, Netanya, Bat Yam, tends to be lower than the center-left strongholds. That tends to be about 7-10% higher. So in the Likud strongholds, there's more potential for firing up the base because there's more, I would say, more fluff, more votes to work with. So again, whether Mr. Netanyahu will be able to fire up his own base is a second very important factor. Third is again, if one of the four parties in the anti-Netanyahu camp, Labor, Meretz, Ram, and Chadash Ta'al, are whether they cross, whether any of them does not cross the threshold. If any one of those four parties that does not cross the threshold, it would be pretty safe to assume that it's game over in favor of Mr. Netanyahu. And again, if we compare to all past elections, there's always at least one big surprise. So we don't know what it's going to be. But those are the things to look out for. But all of this, the combination is in order to, there's one figure that is the most important at this point, whether the pro-Netanyahu bloc achieves 61. Again, we have to wait and we have to look, and all these factors, we analyze them in light of this one. If Netanyahu ultimately in the final result achieves 61 and above, it means he can form a government. If not, then we're in the world of scenarios.
So in a way, we could find ourselves in another round within the near future.
This is one of the scenarios, yes.
Which is not a scenario which would be good for the country.
No, it's not going to be good for the country. Also a narrow government of the assuming a narrow government of the pro-Netanyahu camp of 61 that is fully dependent on the most radical forces of Israeli politics and ultra-Orthodox parties with a great appetite is also a bad scenario. And a scenario of nobody forming a government and rolling to a sixth election is also a bad scenario. So it's pretty much, again, unless there's the outcome would be very different from the polls, we're looking politically at a combination of bad, very bad, and terrible scenarios.
Wonderful. Is the international arena, does that also play a role? What's going on in Russia and Ukraine, Western Europe, United States, China? Does that also have an impact on Israeli elections? Is coming up from the audience? No.
The short answer is that it does not. I mean, obviously, those are very important. There are some hugely important developments throughout the world. Any Israeli dealer has to deal with them and will have to deal with them. It has virtually zero implication on the actual political patterns and political behavior of Israelis that are, as I mentioned before, deeply immersed in identity politics and tribal politics and have no attention span for analyzing implications. So, however, it will have implications on the degrees of freedom of maneuver and for a future government. Again, so there will be implications if there's an interim government or if there's a narrow Netanyahu government that depends on very extreme forces. For sure, it won't make it easy for Mr. Netanyahu to expand and solidify the relationship with the moderate Arab countries. Elements, people like Smotrich and Ben-Gvir who lead this extreme right-wing party, Otzma Yehudit and Tzionut Datit, religious Zionism, they have a strong agenda to change the status quo, say, in Temple Mount. Temple Mount is the most explosive piece of land for sure in the Middle East. One of the most explosive one in the world. And if they will have so much political power in a government and they will not change their views and their thrust towards changing the status quo, I can't see anything stable coming out of this. From a security standpoint, this is probably the factor that keeps me most awake, not the Iranian challenge, where I don't see much difference in policy between the different governments. But on this issue, I think if those politicians will have political power, it will be difficult to prevent them from making provocations on Temple Mount that will, using social networks and so on, percolate and lead to much instability that your daughter and my daughter will have to deal with.
Although I do hope, and that's a personal statement for the audience, that I hope that these politicians, when they do take their position, will be more responsible, because these politicians also have children who are serving in the army and also have are not removed from what goes on in the day-to-day life. So I hope that what they're stating verbally today is not going to be the case if they do take
well, there's a famous assumption that power moderates. You say what you need to say in order to pamper or to sort of connect with people's emotions and to turn it into political power. And then once you're in power, power moderates and you act responsibly. This many times is true, and sometimes it's not true. It's quite a dangerous experiment, and I hope we do not have to conduct it, but we might.
Do you have an opinion about our neighboring countries, what they would like to see in Israel? Would they prefer to see a more right-wing government or more left-wing? Do they have any interest in how they view the stability of the country?
Well, I think generally, they would, they have no interest in the domestic crisis and the independent judiciary and Netanyahu's needs with respect to his trial and so on. They have, zero interest in that, and probably they would want to see a stable, broad, moderate government that they can sort of predict its decisions, that will have sufficient power to sideline and marginalize and undermine any provocations or provocateurs and so on. So they would want a sort of mainstream moderate government. I don't think anyone expects a major diplomatic breakthrough with the Palestinians or something, because there's no real option for that. We can, we can spend time on a different webinar analyzing the Palestinian side and the options. So I don't think that's on the agenda, sort of any breakthrough, but they would want a solid, stable, middle of the road government that can be reliable. For sure, our moderate neighbors, if it's Jordan, Egypt, the Gulf states, they're looking at Iran, and they want Israel as a solid partner to deal with this growing regional threat.
Well, that's interesting. Maybe, as we go along, since I'm not going to do a Q&A session because embedding questions that are coming up from the audience, we have around just under 200 participants, which is remarkable. And many of my questions are representing the questions that have come up throughout your presentation. Wonderful feedback on the presentation. In a way, do you feel that this elections is not only an ideological elections between right and left in Israel might be a little bit different than right and left in other
there's
Western
center,
countries.
there's a strong centrist component in Israel as well.
Right. Versus a more populistic personal leadership question, meaning it's not only an ideological question, but it's also, as you mentioned earlier, who will be the head of the country. Where do you think there's more weight, more towards ideology or more towards the personal potential prime minister?
Well, the traditional ideologies of what it means to be right, left, and center in Israel have been completely transformed. If until the, say, mid-60s, the main axis of right and left was around economic issues, since the 30s until the 60s, Ben Gurion was on the left because he was more of a, socialist, and Likud was right because they were for an open economy. Then it was transformed after the 6-Day War. It was transformed until, I would say, mid-90s, mid-2000s, to the question of what's your attitude towards the Palestinian issue? If you are for land for peace, you're on the left, and if you're for greater Israel, it's on the right. Both those big ideas have lost their petrol, lost their energy after the Second Intifada and the disengagement. We won't get into it, but there's no sort of greater Israel. Even those on the right who do not want to control the lives of millions of Palestinians. They're speaking about various forms of autonomy and so on. And those on the left no longer, or the majority no longer, think that it's just about, if we just agree to give up on land, there will be a European peace like Germany and France. So this big struggle lost its inertia because of the reality. And now the struggle between right, left, and center is again more about questions of identity, about what is Israel's character how should Israel's character as a Jewish and democratic state look like, and what are its values, and how should its institutional makeup look like. So to some extent we sort of back to square one with more fundamental questions. The questions around the economy and security are not so much about big ideologies, but more about competence. Who can deliver the goods? Who do I trust? So to answer the short answer to your questions, yes, it's a referendum about who do you think can deliver the goods, who's competent and can deliver the goods on security, the economy, not ideologically, but de facto. And behind that, there's also a big debate on how do you view Israel and Israeli democracy and Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. And very, very broadly and superficially, the more you are religious, you tend to be on the Israeli right, and the more you are secular, you tend to be on the Israeli center left, and the more you're traditional, you can go either way.
As we are ending this very interesting and important presentation, would you like to end with any final comments or remarks?
Perhaps just one, because, Israel is a wonderful place with wonderful people, with ingenuity, energy, people who love the country. Now, if you look at the hard facts, the institutional arrangements, everything that we discussed, you can come out with quite a grim picture. But then at the same time, when we look at the historical trajectory, good things keep happening and the economy grows, and we somehow, Israelis want to live in a prosperous, successful state. So although there are some grim scenarios, somehow things do have, turn out positively. So although, I don't take it for granted, and I'm devoting my life to it, and I lead an institution that is devoted to strengthening Israeli economy, Israeli institutions, and to produce ideas and so on. But something in me is very optimistic that ultimately, after making all the bad choices, we make the right choices as well.
Well, thank you for ending in that note. There were many, many questions throughout this presentation. I was unable, and I apologize in front of the audience, to address all the questions. And I would like to, first of all, thank you very much for taking the time and being with us, Yohanan. I'd like to thank the audience for joining us. Your support enables us to conduct these webinars, and invite you all to support us so we can continue with these and other important activities. Please join us for the second presentation on the topic, where we will be discussing the post-Israeli elections on December 4th. An invitation will be posted on this. We also invite you to join us on this coming Sunday, November 6th, for a very special webinar featuring our high school youth ambassador program, where we will having visiting young youth from cities around Israel and from the United States joining together. So this is on this coming Sunday, November 6th. Once again, thank you all for joining, and we are a strong democracy, and we're here to stay. Toda Yohanan, and toda rabba to all.
Thank you.